So I don't know if our viewers are familiar with you yet, because I don't think we have your artist profile up, which will be up soon. And I'll drop that in the link probably by the time this video comes out, we'll have that. But
Yeah,
why
right
don't you
on.
tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do? And yeah, promote yourself. This is your time, Vic. Go for it.
Right on, man. Well, my name is Vikram Shankar. I am an American keyboardist, pianist, producer, mixing engineer, but primarily keyboardist and producer. And I work in a few bands, an American-based progressive metal band called Redemption, a multinational piano vocals duo called Silent Skies, and I have a few of my own projects, Lux Terminus being the chiefest among them. And aside from that, I do a lot of mixing production work for other people and a lot of keyboard recording work for other people. So my primary gig is either recording and writing keyboards for myself or for other people. And I've been doing that for a few years now since I graduated conservatory and loving almost every minute of it.
Nice. Awesome. So yeah, Vic and I know each other. We sort of only crossed paths very briefly at Oberlin, but super cool project. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of our audience knows Redemption, but Lux Terminus was I really enjoyed that album a lot. And then you have a new record with Silent Skies, is that right? That just came out?
Yeah. Our debut record came out, I guess, just a couple of weeks ago after
Nice.
working on it for almost 4 years.
That's awesome. I listened to you sent me a link to the page and I listened to the lead single and I really liked it. So I'm looking
Oh,
forward
thanks,
to
man.
sitting down and digging into it more this weekend.
It's
But
definitely a sit down and dig through album. It's not
yeah,
really for casual listeners, but I mean,
hmm
we hope
I
that it's the sort of thing you can get lost in, though, if you give it the
absolutely.
time.
I find that your music, one of the things that I really like about your music, and I think this is, correct if I'm wrong, this is something that I think is really cool about a lot of the prog and metal scenes, is there's so many layers. I can come back and I can dig in a second, a third, even fourth or fifth time, and I'm still discovering new stuff in it. That's the way the Lux Terminus album was for me, at least. I gave that like half a dozen listens through before I felt like I had started to really be able to pick out some of the stuff. And even still, if I go back and listen, I'm sure I would still hear more stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's part of the fun of working in a genre that goes by the blanket term progressive. I mean,
mhm.
there's internal debates on what is really progressive and no one really knows. But one thing that I think we can all agree on is that in that world, you can pretty much anything goes. And that allows for a lot of experimentation that I think in a lot of other types of metal and rock, for instance, you don't really have that opportunity.
Mhm.
But at the same time, the best progressive rock and metal is still accessible. So if you're the sort of person who wants to listen a couple times and enjoy it, you can. But if you go a little bit further, you'll always find things when you dig in deeper. And I love leaving those kind of sonic Easter eggs, if you will,
Yeah,
to
I love.
reward the people who really want to spend the time.
Yeah. I love that. I love that term, sonic Easter eggs. They're like little bits of ear candy. What's the process for you? I'm curious about this because I remember one of the things that really stuck out in my mind from the few times we did really get to talk at Oberlin was when you gave I think it was your senior project, uh,
Yeah.
where you did a really in-depth analysis of Howard Shore's music, but instead of doing Lord of the Rings, which has been obviously talked about quite a bit, you went and analyzed his work with David Cronenberg, which was super fascinating. I had not ever really heard an analysis of the music in Cronenberg's films, but the way you broke it down was like I remember my teachers, like all the professors and all the students, we were just sitting there like, this is fucking mind blowing. Like Vic
Yeah.
is so smart when it comes to like, I mean, obviously the musicality of things, but like the music theory and the musicology behind it, just had such a grasp of that. And I think for me, that moment was like, oh, this is someone who really knows their stuff. Is that like and I remember there was one moment you talked about how the music choreographed not directly to what you were seeing on screen, but kind of to a more conceptual, like it almost acted as an element in the film where it sort of would trick you sometimes. And the way that it would build up and layer was very surprising. Is that something that you think about in your music? Because I find that sometimes like nothing is disharmonious, but every once in a while your music does something that really surprises me, and the way that you manage to fit it in to the whole is like feels very there's like there's a real symbiosis there. Can you talk
Oh,
about that a little bit?
that's really nice of you to say, and it's cool that you understand, you know, the basic idea that my music is trying to work on multiple levels. But I
Hmm.
think honestly, it just comes down to I have a very obsessive nature
Mm,
when I do, I guess, anything, but especially music. And I think if I'm creating an album, for instance, it's very difficult for me to create an album that doesn't function on that deeper level, that's not trying
mm,
to communicate something narratively, thematically, emotionally, and aesthetically all at the same time. You know, if you ask me to just create some pleasant ear candy, I can do it. I have done it, but you know, it's not really something that gets my gears going.
yeah.
And I think even back when I was studying that Cronenberg stuff, I loved the narrative sophistication, not sure what word I was reaching for, sophistication behind what was going on there, because you know it's setting a mood, but it's doing so much to advance the story along. And as you point out, sometimes it's subversive and it's trying to lead the viewer in directions that they don't expect. And I think that's perhaps in the more mainstream music fields, that's something that could be explored a lot further, is
Mm,
the idea that you know your music can convey so much more than pleasing tones. Not like
yeah.
there's anything wrong with pleasing tones, but you know the possibilities are endless if you put your mind to it. And like I say, I think it comes down to obsession and the fact that I love weaving these threads through my music.
Hmm. That reminds me of there's a friend of mine named Scott Miles who has a startup which is called Secret Chord Laboratories, and they do basically they do analysis of mostly mainstream and popular music, but also other kinds of music. And one of the things that they look for is why popular songs have become popular, and they analyze them from a lot of different perspectives, and they use neuroscience and they use music theory and things like that. And normally I'm a bit skeptical of this because a lot of that kind of analysis I've seen in the past, people are like, it's kind of got Silicon Valley, like this is super high tech, we're changing the world, whatever. And then it's like they come up with like, well, people like C and G chords one after the other. And it's like, that's so dumb. That's like the lowest form of musical analysis that you could
Mm-hmm.
possibly come up with. But this one is really interesting because they've discovered, or their methodology really focuses on this element of surprise. And they said, actually, the reason that a lot of songs are popular is because they establish a form or a set, and then they break that. And the sense of surprise and the way that that sense of surprise is conveyed is part of why music is like sounds good and is popular, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
really interesting. I'll have to send you a link to some of their work because I think you would be interested in it. But
That's cool. And what I like is that you're talking about this in the context of popular music, not something
yeah,
super avant-garde and out of the
right.
popular consciousness. Because I think, you know, people underestimate, I think musicians and artists underestimate how far your listeners are willing to go,
Yeah.
you know. And
Hmm.
you can, you know, I guess, quote unquote, mess with people. You can throw them for a loop and people will enjoy that. I mean, look at how successful thriller movies are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can have such blockbuster, huge mainstream success out of twisting people's expectations. And, you know, I love doing that with my music, which is admittedly not very mainstream, but I love when I hear that in mainstream music as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really cool when a song with, you know, this really cool key change or maybe an unexpected odd meter or something really
Hmm.
strikes a chord with people.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's also it helps to tell the story. And I think a lot about, I mean, you know, obviously at Oberlin, we were exposed to an enormous amount of really avant-garde, really weird music. And I think a lot about the fact of like, or rather, maybe not the fact of, but the goal of music being that it wants to be effective at whatever it's trying to do, right? If it's drone music, it wants you to be meditative and space out. If it's ambient, right? If it's like, you know, rock music, you want to rock out. If it's EDM dance music, like you're supposed to dance or kind of vibe out, whatever. Um, And I think that for me, one of the things that I realized in especially Brian Allegont's theory classes, the upper level theory classes, was music can be effective only if it sets up some kind of form. It doesn't have to be super structured. Even improvised music, I think, can have this, but it has to set up some kind of conceit. Like, here is the structure we're going to work within, and here's what we're going to establish, and there's something you can kind of hang on to, and then we're going to change that. And that's, I think, something that's core to maybe there's music out there that doesn't do that, but a lot of the music, and especially most things that are like listenable or harmonious or not totally just like weird hexany bleep bloop, stuff, which is mathematically interesting. But I think most music has to set up some kind of conceit, some kind of form, and then surprise you by breaking that or by morphing it in some way. And I think part of
I like that.
I think that's part of too why like progressive music is so cool, because the form is subservient to telling the story, right? It's not just like, here's like in pop music, an example that Scott showed me a lot was like, hey, here's a Whitney Houston tune, and I Will Always Love You, right? And it's like it's chugging along in, I think, D or something like that, and then all of a sudden the chorus comes in, she goes up an octave, the dynamics explode in the chorus, and all of a sudden you're in A, and it's just like out of nowhere. There's no common tone. There's like, yes, it's a fifth above, but other than that, they don't prep you for it at all. It just explodes out of nowhere, and she blasts the chorus an octave higher than the rest of the song. And it's surprising. That's why it works. But what I think is kind of cool for me about some of the progressive music, and certainly some of, again, the Lux Terminus album, was that like it's telling a story. It's not just surprising to be surprising. It's surprising because it was leading me somewhere. Is that something, do you kind of plan out, I guess that kind of leads to my next question. Do you plan out albums like all the way through, or do you kind of like patch them together like a collage? What's your process when you're thinking about things like in that sense?
I would say I've done a bunch of albums with a bunch of different approaches, because I'm still trying to figure out what feels the best for me.
Sure.
Writing. But the way I like writing the most, it seems, is I'll start by pretty much feeling my way around. And I'm a big believer in the idea that a piece of music, be it a song, an album, whatever, that music has some identity of its own.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is verging on the spiritual for me, but I always have thought that songs have souls, and the best thing you can do is listen to what your song is trying to do and honor what it's trying to do. And if you're going to deviate from what it's trying to do, you better have a damn good reason for it. So the way I end up writing a lot of the times is I pretty much write linearly across a thread of what I'm trying to say. And if I'm trying to say something that requires me to take a sharp left turn, I will do it. But it's because I'm trying to say something. If the song wants to go in a certain direction and I take a sharp left turn because I felt like it, as a screw you to the song or something, I think it doesn't work. And I think people will hear that. They'll be able to tell there was no reason for it to do this. It did this because the songwriter was messing around. And I think people immediately can tell, hey, there's something messed up about this. And sometimes that really, it has its audience. There are people who really enjoy that.
Sure.
And no shade against that. But for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, you can get away with a lot of things if there's proper intent. And the Lux Terminus album was a concept album. And so it has so many different styles within it because I was trying to say things with those styles. The fact that there's an ambient free-form jazz-ish but out of time floaty piece in the middle of this prog rock album is intentional, and I don't think that everything has to have profound meaning, and I don't think that you should shy away from something if it doesn't have profound meaning. But I think that you should just be aware of, the fact that everything you do as a songwriter has ramifications for the meaning of the song and the efficacy of the song. And it's almost this sort of thing where like you have almost a responsibility as a songwriter to like pay attention to the soul of what you're writing, you know?
Yeah, yeah. That's something that's a really cool idea. And I think there's a fine line. I find sometimes myself overthinking it a little bit, where I'm like, you know, uh, the way that like what a song needs, I think is something that almost every musician that I know is like, no, yeah, you can just feel when something feels like it's right and it's there, and overthinking it almost inevitably kills that vibe. Um, I do wonder also, because I hear in some of your records as well, this kind of pervasive either harmonic or rhythmic structure. Like it feels like you're working with a similar palette of tools. Is that something you do intentionally, or is it something that kind of just happens because you're like in the sphere of ideas?
I tend to write what I like, and that's not unique.
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
every musician kind of
Sure.
has their thing that they like doing. But there are times when I want to break out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, going back to what I said, I'll do that if there's a reason for it.
Okay.
But you know, some artists really thrive off of experimentation for the sake of experimentation.
Yeah.
And I respect a ton people who can do that, because I think that's so intellectually brilliant. But
Mm.
I experiment when I'm moved to, you know, and for some people, my output is super eclectic. And for other people, it's super pedestrian. They're like, why are you so diatonic all of the time? It's like, I don't know, I like it. I feel like I can say more things diatonically than I can in other harmonic languages.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
speak them, but I'm not emotionally fluent. I'm technically fluent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I would rather be emotionally fluent and say something that means a lot to me. And I think that I've kind of been able to tell with my fans that, you know, there are certain fans who like certain sides of what I do, and those same fans are often very bored by other things I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially like some of the Lux Terminus stuff where I really wanted to experiment. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I wrote a lot of that while I was at college,
Yeah.
and you know,
Yeah.
college is the stereotypical place to do all of your wacky stuff,
Yeah.
and I really love it. Honestly, I'm very proud of it, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
what I listen to is very experimental. But I found that the people who loved that, you know, some of them love Silent Skies, and some of them think that it's boring that I'm writing in 4/4 all of a sudden. But it's like,
Right.
well, I don't know. I don't think that kind of music would benefit from gratuitous odd meters or anything.
No, no. That was actually going to be my follow-up question, is like, for you, where did you first discover this sense of um, musical intent? Because so we've talked a little bit about kind of the theoretical side of it now, but the playing side is actually maybe even more important, because you can take a really simple the Beatles are a good example of this. You can take an ultra simple song, and if you play the heck out of it and are just incredibly in it and like just emotionally really committed to the song, it's going to sound amazing no matter how simple it is. At least I've discovered that in my
Yeah.
musical journey. What was like, was there a genesis of that for you, or was it just something you realized over time?
Well, the funny thing is that for a lot of my life, I was most inspired by technically adventurous, brilliant music.
Mm-hmm.
I I guess if you want to call it shredder music or whatever,
Yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's keyboards or guitar or drums or bass or saxophone, I don't care. I loved shred. I was all
Mm-hmm.
about it, and I worked really hard. I practiced my scales. I did all my stuff, and then I hit a point where I realized that everyone could shred better than me. At least I perceived it that way.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
man, I'm so far behind the curve, and that was a source of a lot of insecurity for a long time. And
Mm.
I don't, it's difficult to be objective, you know, about like how technically competent you actually are. But I
Yeah.
reached a point at it where I was like, what do I really want to say? You know,
Mm.
do I really want to speak with flurries of notes all the time?
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the realization that actually the way that I'm moved to perform is actually not with the flurry of notes. And I would rather say, volumes with 5 notes than, be more trivial about each note, because I'm so much about intent that I found, for me personally, if I throw too much out there, I am not able to give as much intent to each note. And I don't think that's true for everybody, because I know a lot of people who are like, man, when people play more than 16th notes, they're overplaying and it means nothing, and play the blues scale and like whatever, And I don't think that's true. I think that there are some people who can say a ton with a lot of notes. I mean, I don't think you can listen to John Coltrane and say there's no intent.
Right.
And he's playing all over the place. So like,
absolutely.
I think that's a terrible fallacy, to be honest. And it's just people writing off the music that doesn't move them.
Yeah.
But for me, I found that it's easy for me to gloss over the notes when I'm, not really considering everything that I'm doing.
Yeah.
So if I do shred, I try to really be careful and intentful about it and say exactly what it needs to be saying. And I do it at a point in the narrative of the music where it makes sense, because sometimes a lot of notes expresses an emotion that you really want to express.
Yeah.
It's tough to express frenetic, nervous energy with 2 notes.
Right.
I mean, it can be done, but it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
But generally speaking, I found that my musical identity became so dependent on emotional narrative that I was just speaking clearer with more restraint.
I like that. That's really funny that you mentioned that too, because my journey was somewhat similar. It was like, I spent all this time, learning the technique and trying to be technical and learning to be a better keys player and learning to be a better singer and all that kind of stuff. And then, and it was one of your videos. I saw one of your videos early on, I think when we were in college, and I was like, damn, Vic is so good. He's like, holy shit, this guy can shred so well. This is crazy. But you're totally right. I think my discovery, at least within technique, was that it was harder, at least for me, to play softly, slowly, with control and with direction, with intent. And it's something that catches my ear more. I mean, some people might like really complicated stuff for the sake of being complicated. I listen to some pretty weird, complex music, but generally, even 12-tone, right? Like Schoenberg is incredibly soulful, romantic music. But it's just like his expression was in the complexity of the structure.
Or take counterpoint in general. Take some of the more thorny Bach works or something. I mean, it's so beautiful, but if you just look at the notes on the page, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so daunting. But if you listen to it, it's so soulful.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why the Glenn Gould recordings of Bach tend to be still really popular because they're weird, and they're a weird interpretation of it, but like he is hearing the bounce and the playfulness and the joy in the music, and not just, I mean, how many Bach recordings are there out there that it's like, sounds like, it's like, okay, cool, it could be a computer playing it.
I know. I hate that.
They're awful.
I absolutely hate that, because it's like
bone dry.
You're just missing the point. If the point was to sound bone dry, then you've nailed it.
Yeah.
But I mean, for instance, such an emotionally spiritual composer as Bach was, and the amount of religious importance that he placed upon his music, there's no way he wants that to be dry. He wants it to be, an expression of faith.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's my take on it as well. So this actually brings me to another interesting point, which is something that I don't know if I necessarily struggle with it as much anymore, but it is something that kind of occupied my musical attention for a long time. And I'm curious to know what your thought on it is. When playing with virtual instruments or playing with digital keyboards or things like that are not real acoustic, sound in a space, do you find that affects your creative process at all? Versus like real acoustic instruments?
I had like a pendulum swing where that's concerned, because I did nothing but play on a grand piano until like 8th or 9th grade or so.
Wow.
And then when I discovered certain artists like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Dream Theater,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people who are using, you know, in Emerson, Lake and Palmer's case, a lot of synthesizers and
Yeah.
organs.
Mm-hmm.
Dream Theater using a lot more digital synthesizer and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It's like it rocked my world in the best way. And I was like, this is so cool. You can do so many things now. You can explore so many timbres that are not the traditional piano.
Yeah.
And then after a while, I got burned out, and I was like
Mm.
thinking that everything sounded artificial to me, and I turned into a cranky old guy about all the synths and everything, you know. But
Yeah.
but now I'm at the point where it's like I love the fact that, you know, at the risk of beating a dead horse, everything is so has to be so essentially expressive to me, and
Mm.
so intentful that I find that there are some things that I can't express with an organic instrument, or
Yeah.
I could, but it's a lot easier and more
Mm-hmm.
direct, and it'll hit people more powerfully. For instance, to use a Hammond organ running through a distorted guitar amplifier versus a piano played loudly,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And you know, I love the fact that I can express so many different things with different tools, and at the same time it does all feel like me, because you know, at the end
Mm.
of the day, I'm the one doing it, and I'm not going to do something that doesn't feel like me.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes I used to overthink, you know, am I going too far in this direction? While I was still in college, I released this EP that was like inspired by a lot of drum and bass music, and there was a ton of very hard hitting saw synths and EDM stuff all over the place,
Yeah.
and did all virtual drums. And then
Mm-hmm.
I kind of was like, man, should I take that off the internet? Do I want people to know I did this? I was like, of course I do.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course I want people to know that's me. It's me, you
Yeah.
know? So it's like, and I'm fortunate that I've been able to kind of preserve a feeling of connection with instruments, even if they
Mm.
are not analog. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, there are some people who can't do that. There are some people, if they're playing a virtual instrument, it doesn't feel like an instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. But for me, I'm so just interested in the way it sounds that it's like, if it sounds good, it sounds good. And
Yeah.
that's my quest,
Mm.
is for the perfect sound, not how I feel while doing it. As long as it
Yeah.
says what I want it to say.
Right. Right. So you look maybe more for texture than for vibe.
Yeah. And then I have things if I want vibe, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like the Silent Skies album, we did all the piano with a real Steinway
Right.
because we wanted that vibe.
Yeah.
You know, I love being able to use analog gear when I can. Like
Mm-hmm.
I had this acquisition back here, the Chord Prologue
Nice. That's a really cool
synthesizer.
synth. That's a really cool workstation.
Did so much vibe on that thing.
It's got great. It sounds great. Like I know there's a lot of people who are really into vintage synths, but I think some of the not crazy expensive modern synthesizers we have now are like, we're in like a golden age for accessibility, because you can get such great sounds like the Mini Brute, the Mini
Oh
Moog.
yeah, dude, the Arturia stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And it sounds good. Like, you know, you can get little 808 kits now from like Teenage Engineering and stuff like that that sound really good for like less than $100. It's really, really cool.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, if I want something that feels like a natural expression of organic musicality,
Yeah.
I have that. And I mean, I honestly, probably 90% of what I do is in the box, both with recording
Sure.
and with mixing,
Sure.
because it works, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about that. When you mix, I mean, obviously you produce and record a lot of the things that you do, and then you also mix them, right? Which is kind of like part of that newer generation of like younger folks like us who we grew up digital, and it's like the mixing process flows into the production process. Do you, what's your take on, you know, like piano and guitar and common instruments, do you tend to do a lot of things to them? Do you tend to be more minimalist? Is there certain plugins that you always reach for? Is it kind of just whatever the album needs? Like what's your process there?
Well, I think it depends on the record, but for a lot of my own records, I'd say that mixing begins way before I've opened the mixing template up. Well, I don't use a template, but before I open the mixing session up. And, you know, while I'm tracking, I'm making choices of how I envision things to sound. And a lot of that has to do with the way I use time-based effects.
Like delays.
As well as the way I shape sounds with preliminary EQ. Like, not to do problem solving or anything, but just to give it a vibe. Whether I want something to be sparkly or have a honk, mid-range honk, or be scooped or whatever, I'll generally tackle all of those things in the beginning of the process.
Interesting. And
bounce it all down. And then once I'm in the mixing stage, I have these tracks with, you know, especially with time-based effects. I usually have that all baked in going into the mix.
Okay.
And then my goal when mixing is just to take all the stuff I tracked and make it gel, give it the vibe that I want with the clarity I want, and all of that. If I mix someone else's stuff, I tend to be a little bit more heavy-handed.
Okay.
I actually, you may think it would be the other way around, that I'd want to be more cautious with other people's music, but the thing that I find is that with other people's music, I like doing a lot of very subtle things. So sometimes my channel strips will look insane with, like, you know, way more plugins than is conventionally advisable. But then if you open each one up, there's like, I have a plugin open for 0.5 dB at 15K, and that's it.
Interesting. Yeah.
You know, I like doing things like that because I've maybe in the last couple of years become a bit of a plugin whore. I used to be very, very, very conservative about my plugins. And I only really would use a small handful for mixing.
Yeah.
And the last couple of years, I've really kind of blown that notion to smithereens. And I don't know if financially it's the wisest thing for me to be doing, but as far as like the product goes, you know, I think that there is something special about using a tool in the way that it works best and not forcing it to do things that it doesn't do best. And so you pull from a big collection of things and only use the things that they're really, really good at. And then, of course, I have a couple of workhorse plugins that I'll use on like every track. But aside from that,
what are your workhorse plugins? Like, name a couple.
So, I'd say on the vast majority of my mixes, I'm using Brainworks channel strips.
Okay.
On the rock and metal stuff, I'm using their SSL. I think I use the 4000G, I think. But for rock and metal, I just find that its voicings, you know, especially I use it only for broadband EQ. If I'm being surgical, I'll go to a graphic usually. The Fab Filter Pro Q, 10 times out of 10 is what I'm using for surgical stuff. But for the rock and metal, the SSL just has this character. I mean, of course, it's SSL, but I love that Brainworks has this thing called TMT, where I don't know if you know about this.
But all the channels are modeled differently. You can use it as like on all your channels as like a
and you can
console emulation.
The randomize button, and each one has a slightly different voice, and it sounds like the sort of thing that's just like marketing crap.
It does. I mean, you can hear it.
It does make a difference.
You can hear it,
especially in separation. You can really hear it.
And I feel like that's like part of that. The whole analog console emulation thing is because like digital summing buses, it like just straight through the digital summing bus. It's like everything's all at the same level, and it's just a little bit too. It's almost like too holistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, depth is variation, right? When it comes to mixing, it's like the more subtle variation you can have, the wider the mix will sound. That's why you double track a rhythm guitar, for instance. Is the subtle variations is what gives you the depth. Yeah. So, I mean, I love the TMT stuff. They have it in another channel strip that I use a lot, which is their Focusrite console.
Yeah, the ISA one.
Yeah, which I use for things that are generally on the lighter side, but also I like it on drum rooms, and cymbals.
It's a little warmer, I find.
Marvelous sounding, and it has a wicked compressor.
Yeah, that old Focusrite
Especially
compressor.
dialed in parallel.
Yeah,
it's so easy to just twist the mix knob down to 40 or 50, and it's just fantastic.
It reminds me of the I don't know if did you ever work in con audio at Oberlin?
No.
We had a Neve 88 RS console in Clonic, the big recording studio, and that one had a compressor it was the 88 compressor, but it was based off of like the 87 502 or something like that from Neve. It was after the initial Neve compressors, but that compressor sounds a lot like the Focusrite compressor, and it's just like, it's warm, but it's not woolly or too bassy, and it's just got this real smoothness it just sounds awesome on everything. It's like, put it on everything. It sounds great.
Honestly, I think if you look at on the mixing page of my mixing sessions, it's like 90% plug-in Alliance stuff.
They make good.
I used to be like 90% Wave stuff, and I like a lot of the Wave stuff for what it is.
Yeah.
I kind of migrated over with time because it just suits my workflow better.
Yeah.
They have the Purple Audio MC77.
I've heard really good things about that one. I've never used it, but
it's like an 1176 on steroids.
But yeah, basically.
It's fantastic. Like especially for bass and drum parallel compression, it's like it's such a winner.
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself like a little bit confused sometimes by the plugin environment where you're like, cool, it's an old API 1600. What does that mean?
I used to be the sort of confused where I had to go dive in and figure out what it is and then inevitably buy it. And now I'm at the point now where I'm still confused, but it's like, I guess I'll always be confused. That's my life.
If you didn't, I feel like we're a little bit of a leg down with that one because we just didn't grow up with that. Like I have some friends, like Dave McNair, who I introduced you to. Like he just knows what that stuff sounds like. He's like, oh yeah, it's like an old, I'm like, I mean, I've heard that name a million times, but I wasn't there when that unit came out, and I didn't use it on a million hit record. Like it's just that sound is burned into some older engineers' heads, and for us, we're like, cool, sure, whatever.
I became the sort of person at this point where like I just know what I can do to achieve the best result for me.
You know your tools, yeah.
And so if an API works best for some guy, fantastic. I believe that it probably is better for the job than what I'm using. But I'm doing okay with what I got. And I'm at the point now where I don't want to buy anything else. It's like I want to learn to maximize what I have, and that's why I used to be really afraid of using channel strips. Like I didn't like the idea of doing so many things in one plugin because of the attitude I mentioned before, where it's like I like to use different tools for different things.
Gotcha.
But I'm at the point now where I force myself. It's like, how far can I get with this channel strip? And especially when I first open a mix, normally the first thing I'll do on any given track is I'll pull up either that Focusrite or the SSL, or occasionally Lindell Audio has a really nice like vintage Neve one that I'll occasionally use. And I'll pull it up and I'll get as far as I can. And then once I get there, maybe we'll pull out. Plugin Alliance has this Mag EQ4 plugin. I don't know if you know this one.
Yep. Yeah, I know that one.
Like, holy crap, that thing changed my life.
The high end on that is pretty nuts. Yeah, the air band.
But it does so much more than EQ.
Yeah.
Like under the hood, and every band has a different non-EQ way that it impacts the sound. It's crazy, but it's so fun to just take a signal and just start twisting knobs and just see where you end up.
Yeah, it's a little more, it's like how you use analog gear. You kind of twist knobs until stuff just sits, right?
And dude, it's supposed to be fun. I hate when people don't view mixing as a fun activity and B, a creative activity.
Yeah.
For me, mixing is not science, it's art. I mean,
Mhm.
art and science overlap significantly. But for me, I like viewing mixing as almost like another stage of writing and arranging. It's like, especially the way you can creatively use effects and
Mhm.
volume automation and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, the impact you can have on how the song speaks is so drastic.
Oh yeah. I mean, you
And
can.
it's like,
It's like sound design in itself, right? Like it changes it changes the impact. It changes the intent, really,
yeah. And
of the
even if your
music.
client comes to you and he says, I want this track to be, you know, delay and reverb wet. Okay, which delay? Which reverb? How do you want it used?
Yeah.
Can you know, automate the delay channel up and down to fit the ebb and flow of the song?
Mm-hmm.
Right in there, you can so drastically change the way the song hits. And you're starting from the guideline that the client gave you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
especially when I mix my own music, like mixing Lux Terminus and stuff. I mean, I'm like a kid in the candy store with the little absurd things that I'm trying. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just, it's got to be fun. And sometimes you'll make mistakes and it won't work. And then you go back to something you know works. It's all good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you got to
Yeah.
have fun with it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I find mixing to be kind of relaxing in a way
Me
because
too.
you're kind of just, and maybe it's just because we're like really heavy duty musicians who are always thinking about complex musical stuff. And it's like, to me, it's almost a simpler level. It's a more like, there's not a lot of stress when mixing. Like sometimes we'll be like, oh, is it this way or that way? But like I could sit and mix for like 18 hours straight and not eat and not go to the bathroom and then like be like, oh crap, I just spent like a whole day mixing. I didn't even like, I can just zone out into it.
It's funny because that exact experience happens to me while mixing and not while writing or recording.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, same.
people always talk about how they get lost writing and all that, and like they lose track of time while they're composing. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't lose track of time. I'm waiting for lunch and dinner as much as the normal 9 to 5
Yeah.
guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the writing process, but
Yeah.
it's like it stresses me out more.
Yeah,
I think.
I'd agree. I have to think about it a lot more, and I have to like playing to me is a experience I can zone out and be like very zen in. But like actually writing and producing is like it's very
Tracking, especially for me.
yeah.
Because like I said earlier, I try so hard to track with the intent of how it's going to be in the mix.
Right.
So
Do you
that
find
means that,
yourself like having to retrack things a million times because you're fussy?
oh yeah, oh,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
much. And it's especially a pain with anything analog. Because of
Yeah.
course with all the virtual instruments, it's relatively easy to do revisions.
Right. Right.
But with anything analog, whether it's a analog synth part or something I tracked on piano, it's like it can be such a pain. And
Yeah.
dude, you don't want to be around me while I'm tracking guitar. Like stay away until I'm done. Or bass, because I'm so neurotic about bass tuning.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the number one thing that I freak out about is bass tuning. I go so ballistic about every part being in tune. And normally I'll spend like hours and hours tracking each bass part, fanatically tuning each string for each part. And then I'll just go tune it all in Melodyne anyways. So it's like, why did I waste all this time tuning? I don't know. But I'm neurotic. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it strikes me that you kind of have a process. This is a little bit similar to my process actually, and some other film composers I know where like it's not good enough to just play it in because we make things harder on ourselves by like not quantizing everything and not like we basically treat DAWs as like tape machines. We want to track everything in and play it in and have it be manual, and like the grid is not good enough. It has to be more precise and exactly what we want in a way that even the grid is not capable of doing. And that just takes more work. You just have to edit a lot and play stuff in a lot. But that's hard. That requires like you have to be a really good player to do that. You have to be really, really good player with good chops and like know what you're doing to do that.
And you have to have the certain amount of ear to understand.
Yeah.
Like
you have to be a composer, not just a player as well.
Yeah. Like you have the certain amount of ear to know when something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. But then it takes a step above to know exactly how it should be to be right.
Right.
You know? So it's like, I love tracking because of the result.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I wish I could just skip from the writing phase to the mixing phase.
Yeah,
like right
yeah.
now, I'm starting writing the second Lux Terminus album, and already I can't wait to mix it. I'm so excited to mix it because I've learned a million more things than I did when I mixed that record.
Yep, yep.
But it's like, oh man, I gotta track it, and I gotta go get a drum room for the drum recordings,
Yeah,
and we
yeah,
gotta edit the drums. It's like, oh, what a pain.
yeah,
Is it
yeah.
because for Lux Terminus, I don't like using samples in the mix. We didn't use any
Hmm.
on the first record, although some people didn't believe me when I told them that, which is kind of weird.
That is a funny thing. Sometimes the samples sound more like, sometimes the real instruments in the samples don't sound the way you'd think. You would think the samples would sound, you know, uh, like very dry and realistic and all that sort of thing. And then sometimes the real thing, especially with strings, with orchestra, sometimes the real thing comes out so perfect, like more perfect than the samples. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's very
which is
true.
always weird.
And
Um,
I love samples. I mean,
mhm,
I will use samples all over. I mean, if I record a
mhm.
live string section, I love having samples under there for
Yeah.
extra warmth and vibe. If I'm
Hmm.
mixing a drum track, sometimes tucking in a sample underneath is just the perfect reinforcement you need.
Yep.
And I don't know, I don't really understand the whole like purist philosophy behind cheating or
There's
not cheating or whatever. It's like
uh,
doesn't make a lot of sense to me because
no, no.
it's not like I can't do it without the sample. Like of course I can, but
Right.
wouldn't you want it to sound
Yeah.
better and save time while doing it? See,
Well, and
that's the key.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you've ever worked, I don't know if you have, but if you've ever worked on anything TV related, there's no other option unless it's like Downton Abbey where you have a massive unlimited
Hmm.
budget. You have no
Yeah,
time to do an orchestra in a room playing stuff. Especially with the Netflix era, like you have to use
right.
samples. You have no other opportunity, and they have to sound good, and they have to be done like fast.
And they're so good now.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah. The
like
samples sound better, honestly, than the samples in some ways sound like better in a slightly less perfect, more like real string way than sometimes real string recordings can sound. Sometimes real string
yeah,
recordings with really good musicians, it's like the tuning is so perfect that there's no texture of like bow rosin or anything like that. And you're like, are those like cheesy Jupiter 8 strings? Like it's so perfect, it sounds fake,
yeah.
but it's
And
real.
it's funny that you say that because there's a particular issue when it comes to live orchestral musicians in a metal context.
Yeah.
Because a metal mix is so busy that the orchestral parts have
Hmm.
to be played a certain way for it to work
Yeah.
in the mix. And
Yeah.
what that often means is that in order for it to sound tight, they'll have to use less players because,
Hmm.
maybe they have 2 hours to track, a
Sure.
big chunk of music.
Hmm.
So they'll use less players and the players will be top of the line and they'll play a perfect take of everything. But when I listen to albums, normally one, I can tell when it's a real orchestra, and
Yeah.
two, normally I don't like it because normally
Yeah.
there's a vibe that's missing. It's very dry and clinical, and
Yeah.
people are mixing their, a lot of metal mixing engineers are mixing orchestra as if they're mixing like a close mic'd acoustic guitar or something.
Right.
And
It's
it's
like
like,
tons of 4K and no 500.
yeah, and it's like these things have to have body and they have to have
Yeah.
depth and dimension. When people listen to a Hans Zimmer recording, that's what they want to hear.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear some super intimate chamber recording over blasting double kick and down-tuned guitars. It just, I mean, sometimes you do. I actually think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I mean, you know what I mean? It's like the orchestra has got to sound big and bombastic, and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
samples sound that way.
They do. Yeah. They have a lot more 250 than real recordings do generally.
Sometimes it's problematic, and you have to be very
Yeah.
careful with multi-band or something to
Hmm.
take care of those resonances. But the room sounds, especially like the
Yes.
Spitfire stuff where they record in the Air Studio, the giant
Yeah,
halls and everything. It's
when
like,
I use Spitfire anything, I almost always end up using the close mic'd ones because the
yeah,
rooms they sound amazing, but they're like too much.
they won't fit. And it's
No.
like I use the Hans Zimmer strings as one of my
Hmm.
layers usually.
Hmm.
Like I normally have maybe 3 or 4 different tracks, if you will,
Yeah.
to execute any one line. And one of them is usually Hans Zimmer because it has so much character to it. Like I don't love all of the Zimmer.
Yeah.
Ones
Some
that
of them
did,
are, some of them are, yeah, a little too much.
But for my taste, they nailed it with that one.
Yeah.
But even still, you got to be careful with it can almost be too much vibe.
It reminds me, I mean, most of the professional orchestral stuff, a lot of pop music engineers, a lot of mainstream music engineers focus really on that 1 to 4 kilohertz range, and to get that as bright and as tuned out and as like just tricked out as humanly possible. And with orchestral samples, you have to do, it's 2 to 400. It's all right there in that 2 to 400 band. And dealing with that is hard because it's not a band that like it's dense and it can be muddy really quick.
Yeah. And the other thing with metal is that it is inherently a percussive style usually. Right. And it's inherently a style with a lot of tight rhythmics. And a lot of the like younger musicians who don't really know what they're doing with orchestral samples, they'll sound super washy.
It'll just be gloop.
And it won't be on the grid. I mean,
yeah,
you have to put everything ahead of the grid for most
metal even
samples.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Because by the time it goes from MIDI information to sample, you've lost some milliseconds, and then it's going to sound delayed. So it presents its own set of challenges when you're working in the metal field doing metal orchestration, which is something that I've kind of ended up doing a lot of for myself and for hire for other people, which is really interesting because they'll always want your software orchestra to sound like a million things at once. They want it to sound like Hans Zimmer, and they want it to sound like bigger than Hans Zimmer, and they want to hear tons of violins, but they don't want it to sound cheesy. It's like it can be tough creating the right orchestral approach for metal, and normally it means you have to ignore all your training.
Yes, yeah.
Like the things that you learned in conservatory, you got to forget a lot of that.
Yes,
unfortunately, and you got to approach it like a mixing engineer.
Absolutely. Well, because it's all about, it's like we, with the left to right timeline and the way tracks are arranged and all that, it's like the DAWs that we use nowadays, most of them are very heavily based on, how Western sheet music is written, right? But you have to go in with kind of almost a more like Senegalese or like, Indian raga music take where it's like rhythm and texture are king. And I think it's really funny because I did I mixed a score for this movie recently that they were like, oh, we want the strings to sound really upfront and really realistic. And they're kind of like hi-fi classical guys. So they like know what that sounds like. And I was like, crap, that's hard to do. Even with samples, to get it up to the standards of people who are really fussy like that is still hard. And what I ended up doing was I ended up taking, Arturia has the Analog Lab synthesizers. I ended up throwing some like cheesy string synths underneath, and somehow it made the like Bo Rosany really dry, like high frequency sounds just so much more realistic. Like by doing the completely wrong thing, it was like I use it for almost all my string sounds now because it was like adding synths into the strings made them sound so much more. It sold the illusion in a totally different way than the purist.
I think if you want a certain degree of sonic consistency, there's something in a synth string that is just like, okay, attack is instant, constant sound, decay is instant. And your software strings don't have, which I mean, if you're just listening to the string on its own, it sounds better.
Right, like the solo instruments sound great.
Just have it completely natural and gorgeous, but in a mix, that consistency, it can be very helpful to blend something unrealistic underneath.
Well, and going back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, it to the ear from a texture standpoint, because I'm really into some of the weird sound design science, it seemed to give you a baseline against which the string samples then could be differentiated. And so it seemed to actually increase. I thought it was going to make everything sound washier by putting synthesized strings under it because it was going to fill in all the space. But actually what happened was it emphasized the space between the different parts, the violins and the cellos and the basses, and it made everything more distinct, which was not what I was expecting at all, but like worked brilliantly.
No, that's cool. It's interesting, the amount of wrong things that sound the best.
Right, right.
Like how often you can do something that you feel like, okay, I've paid my dues and I've done so many productions and I have conservatory education. I shouldn't be doing this, but it just sounds so good.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, your ears
Ultimately,
have got to rule what you do at the end of the day.
exactly. Ultimately, and that's a whole another topic that we don't have time for today, but that I would love to explore at another time, is this idea of like, why do things that seem to be maybe incorrect or not, the correct way to do things work so well, and like the distance or the space between our muse and our training.
Yeah.
Which I think you can mine a lot of interesting things from that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'd say the tension between those latter two has been my career.
Yeah, I feel like that's where I live all the time, and I love living there because it's like, it's such an exciting place to be. It surprises expectations. You're constantly being surprised.
And if you can surprise yourself, then you
yeah,
know that you're going to create something cool for the rest of the world.
right. Exactly. Wow. That's an inspiring quote. I like that. We're about at our 1 hour mark, Vic. So I'm going to let you go, but this has been awesome.
Yeah, man.
Hopefully we
Absolutely.
can do this again if you're up for it. Cause I thought this was super. I think our audience is going to love it. I had fun.
Dude, it would be my pleasure. And we didn't even get to talk about those shiny new headphones I have.
I know. We didn't get to talk about them. But how are you liking them?
They're killer. Actually, it's funny. I did like 4 or 5 mixes in the last few days.
Nice.
Just like speed mixing my way through with them, just to test drive them. And I found that I didn't really know what to expect, because you never do until you finish the product and you test it in all of your different systems. And you're like, all right, what actually happened?
Yeah.
And what happened is that I think I was able to problem solve very easily. And I think that I was able to hone in on consistency across different platforms, because it's like, I finished the mix and I played them on my monitors and I played them in the car and I played them on other headphones. And it's like, it enabled me to get to that stage of consistency without glaring issues faster than I think I have with my previous headphones, which were I was using the Bear Dynamics, which are fantastic headphones in their own right. But I think that, I don't know, I feel like I was just able to identify problem areas. And that's what I use headphones for more than anything else, is while I'm mixing, especially when I'm checking phase and drums, or I'm notching out a rhythm guitar or something, I'll very often reach for the headphones just to hear exactly what's wrong and how can I most efficiently correct what's going wrong. And I found that the LCD ones, it was really painless to get to where I want to be. And I want everything to be painless when I'm working. Nothing turns me off more than when there's a stumbling block in my workflow.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big hassle. Well, that's super.
First impressions are fantastic.
Sweet. I'm glad you like them.
I want to try the close-back ones now, so I can not annoy my girlfriend while working.
Yeah. We'll see if we can make that happen. That would be super cool.